MANDY and Beyond the Black Rainbow. Analyzing these two films was a very interesting and revealing project, and I can't wait to show you what I've discovered. Now, there is so much in these films that I'm not going to be able to cover everything. I'm just going to highlight a few interesting things. So sit back and relax, and let's go through some of these big-ticket items I found to be important for this analysis. MANDY resurrects the badassery and merciless revenge plot, taking it to the point of blacksmithing one's own battle axe, a genre lost to the wokeism of today's commercial cinema. In Cosmatas's universe, set in the mid-80s, at the time of a dramatic shift from a culture completely saturated with half-baked hippie intellectuals to Reagan's campaign for the return to conservative values, MANDY tells the story of an ex-army vet and his girlfriend who live in a secluded home in the Shadow Mountains of Crystal Lake. The film opens with Red on a typical workday as a logger, very manly, masculine work that he clearly despises, not because it's masculine, but because it's a consumerist-driven system that ravages precious resources from the earth, a constant and miserable trigger for this recovering alcoholic that goes against everything he believes. King Crimson's Starless perfectly scores this opening scene as the lyrics depict a man who, on the outside, bravely endures his feelings of hopelessness and emptiness for a world in which he lives, while on the inside feels quote-unquote starless and Bible black, great descriptors for an abysmal and seemingly eternal darkness that perfectly encapsulates this mood and worldview. On his way home, he hears President Reagan giving his famous renewal of traditional values speech on the radio and snaps it off short, almost like the cherry on top of this dismal view of where the world is going, the direction in which the world is going.
A renewal of the traditional values that have been the bedrock of America's goodness and greatness. An overwhelming majority of Americans disapprove.
A pivotal campaign from Reagan on the heels of the 60s counterculture that sent his opponents into a mouth-foaming fury because they were quickly losing the battle for a generation of minds in a 20-year struggle session for the culture. Red is not a conservative values kind of guy. We realize that going into the gate. It's interesting that his shirt is emblazoned with the number 44, or 4 times 11, in Aleister Crowley's system of gematria that represents, quote, the corruption of the created world, end quote, delineated in a collection of his writings titled The Kabbalah of Aleister Crowley. I'll circle back to the meaning behind the number 44 in a minute. Red's only reprieve from the torment of his existence, the only place of sanctuary and meaningful purpose in the midst of this dismal worldview, is his home, in the almost Eden-like setting of the woods of the Shadow Mountains, where his girlfriend, MANDY, a talented artist, creates phantasmagorical works that depict dreamlike, ethereal other worlds, comprised of mythological archetypes of strength, power, nature, and spirituality. Just gazing upon her work, Red recognizes her extraordinary talent and is perhaps for a moment transported to this world for which he would prefer to live. And MANDY, like a mystical goddess, is its creator. Each of her drawings a blissful tangent universe, another branch on the infinite and eternal tree of the multiverse. These aspects of the storyline parallel the film Donnie Darko, a movie I recently analyzed in this video that incorporates the struggle session of the Reagan era and the multiverse and tangent universes and highly intelligent free thinkers, aka esotericists. MANDY's character reflects the 1980s version of counterculture rebellion, with her metal band concert t-shirts and her chemical-dyed black hair and avid interest in the nerd culture of otherworldly fantasy fiction. She carries a lightning bolt-shaped scar on her face, a detail I find very compelling. On the surface, the scar represents that she had been wounded and has survived. She's a wounded warrior, what all battle scars represent. A scar to a woman's face cuts into her beauty and cannot be concealed. She wears it almost like the mark of Cain. I've seen a scar like this before in a 1975 British rock opera titled Tommy, written and scored by Pete Townsend and The Who, and directed by Crowley devotee Kenneth Russell. Known for subversive films like Altered States and The Devils, I've talked about Tommy and Russell's films a few different times in my videos, and most recently here. Tommy is saturated with esoteric symbolism, mostly from the theosophical variety. The story is about a traumatized boy who, as a result, gets locked in his own mind in an autistic-like state and later becomes a gaming hero and a cultural messiah, so to speak. But in the story, there is this odd, disjointed segment that depicts an adolescent girl named Sally Simpson who is enamored by Tommy, her rock god messiah. Her father, depicted as a corrupt religious leader of his church, seen here polishing his Rolls Royce, forbids her to attend a Tommy concert, but she dresses provocatively and beyond her years and sneaks out to attend the concert anyway. She also carries the scar on her left cheek. Of course, Townsend had some problems of this nature back in the day. And the story of Tommy includes that he was also a victim of that same type of abuse, all part of his ascension process toward his enlightenment. The story of Tommy itself was an adaptation of another book titled Arthur, Teenage Pinball Queen, about an adolescent girl who dressed like a boy who enjoyed arcade gaming, an adaptation permitted by friend and industry handler of Townsend's work, Nick Cohn. Arthur is this sleazy, psychedelic, labyrinth-style story. Arthur falls through a carnival funhouse mirror into a degenerate world of brothels, barrooms, and opium dens, kind of like Alice in Wonderland. There she meets a bartender who is really an ancient clairvoyant Chinese sage that teaches her how to reach enlightenment through a series of degenerate behavior. While the story is based on a real girl whom Townsend and Cohn knew, Cohn has said that he invented the character Arthur for his book to depict his alter ego, an androgynous adolescent girl. So there you go. But the Sally Simpson segment has nothing to do with the Tommy storyline other than to show a groupie way too young to be doing what she's doing. Why would Townsend do that when the point could be just as simply made with a woman of proper age? The cheek mark, always on the left, seems more like a ritual scar. Mandy and Red are seen ending their day in serene repose, having a lover's conversation. Red asks her about her day, and she explains that she read that thick book about the galaxy. "What's your favorite planet?" he asks Mandy, who chooses Jupiter. Why? Because the surface of its atmosphere is a storm that's been raging for 1,000 years, and the eye, which is red, is so big it could swallow the whole Earth. Perhaps this is a peek into her psyche, the storm that rages within her, and as a consequence, a silent celebration at the thought of the whole Earth being swallowed up.
What's your favorite planet?
Jupiter. Yeah.
Jupiter was the main Roman god of the ancient Roman Empire, originating from the Greek god Zeus. Jupiter was a militaristic sky god. Minerva was Jupiter's daughter, and it's my analysis that Mandy might be a caricature of Minerva, the goddess of wisdom, seen often with the owl, the goddess of commerce, perhaps subtly represented here with the dollar bill as her bookmark. She was the goddess of art and also war. You can see in this scene she is, in a sense, his wise mystery school instructor, teaching Red about the planets and the gods and myths that they represent.
What's yours?
Saturn, probably.
Yeah. Saturn's pretty cool. And that was one of the first ones that we discovered. The humans discovered, so there's like a lot of cool ancient myths about it and stuff.
Minerva was also the watcher over carpenters and stonemasons. Red represents the Saturn figure, which I will explain in a minute. It's interesting that Mandy, in her telling of the story of the starlings, she speaks of the abuse of her father, who had asked her and a group of children to participate in the slaughter of baby starlings, the slaughter of the innocents, if you will. If you watched my last video on Longlegs and Silence of the Lambs, I talk about the esoteric meaning of the starling. Important in Freemasonry and esoteric tradition, the starling is an instrument of divination. As it is a native bird to ancient Rome, it connects to the Roman Empire. Their massive flocks were observed by oracles who would watch their formations in order to divine and interpret the wishes of the gods. In esoteric tradition, the starling represents high intellect and the collective working of an entire flock working in harmony as one entity. It's a symbol of collectivism. Of course, Mandy describes her father as an abusive tyrant who wants to slaughter the baby starlings before they are even able to fly, and to force Mandy and the other children to participate. The father in these stories will always be depicted as an abusive tyrant because he represents the patriarchy, the current world order. The film's first portion which establishes the Red and Mandy characters inside their environment, sets an alchemical foundation of earth, air, fire, and water, revealing that this is indeed an alchemical esoteric tale, plus a base metal if you include the forging of the Sith. But this is coming from the realm below in its corrupt state, later to be cleansed and purified through a series of transformational rituals involving blood and fire. Every character in this film undergoes either a transmutation or a transformation. Mandy is transformed through ritual fire to her final form. Red is transformed into the Jovan warrior who champions her revenge. The chemist, the sorcerer, has been transformed through the craft of his special sorcery, who, like an oracle, has now obtained the superhuman powers of telepathy and clairvoyance. The Black Skulls, who have been given a special recipe of the chemist's potion, have been transmutated into the most evil and vile of subhuman creatures. First, we see the corrupted Earth, and the pain of both Red and Mandy having to exist in this state, in spite of their choice of isolation in their own little Garden of Eden. The air, as they discuss the planets and the cosmos and their astrological correlation to myths and legends. The night sky above their house, depicted as a surreal, otherworldly dreamscape, two heavenly bodies like eyes watching over them, like Red and Mandy's astrological representatives, as if they are titans themselves. Earth and air are opposites, but eternally connected. One cannot exist without the other. Earth is feminine, air is masculine. Then it segues into a serene scene on the lake, water, which in alchemical terms isn't just H2O, but rather represents the divine water, or the silvery water of Mercury, representing intellect, representing moral judgment and higher cognition. Mercury serves as the bridge between man and the gods. In his book Alchemy, penned by E.J. Holmyard, explains, Mercury goes under many aliases: the silvery water, the ever-fugitive, the divine water, fluidity of the masculine feminine, the seed of the dragon, the bile of the dragon, Scythian water, and so on. Base metal, represented by the Sith, forged by the Jovan warrior himself, looking very mercurial here as it transforms into the instrument of justice. Jovan coming from the English translation of the Latin Jove, meaning Jupiter, I think pronounced Yahweh, sounding a lot like Yahweh, and the Sith, the token weapon of Saturn, who's also known as the Reaper, who plows through all that is considered corrupt like a cosmic destroyer to bring about a new order. Red's favorite planet at first thought is Saturn.
What's your favorite planet?
Jupiter. Yeah, no doubt. What's yours?
Saturn, probably.
Of which he then changes his mind to a character from the Marvel Universe, or should I say the Marvel Gnostic Universe, Galactus. Cosmatos' films are crafted like comic books, and even include comic book-style animated interludes, Red's Dreams, which lend to the genre of animated productions like Heavy Metal, released in 1981, which in that story included an emerald green glowing orb that is the quote-unquote the sum of all evils. The orb represented the sum of all evils that has influenced societies across aeons of time and space, and capable of completely disintegrating anyone who attempted to handle it who wasn't first granted cosmic permission. Galactus eats planets to maintain this, great cosmic balance, taking Red's destroyer spirit, his Saturnalian Reaper spirit, to the next level. Red, as protector and warrior, would eat all the planets to protect Mandy if necessary. Once the king of the gods, Saturn is the god of liberation and of time. He's also Jupiter's father, which makes Saturn Minerva's grandfather, depicted here in this Renaissance painting, seated beside her, protecting the liberal arts, art and science, from envy, personified here as the hideous and pitied Roman goddess of envy, Invidia, which seems to me a lot like the Mother Marlene character. The scene on the lake transitions into a wall of fire, fire representing a divine fire, the alchemical furnace where its digestion takes place. While water is feminine, fire is masculine. Fire and water are opposing elements, and they are both purifying agents. One can be cleansed and purified by water. Fire burns away impurities, bringing about refinement. And through this purifying fire emerges Mandy from the water, her symbol and opposing element of Red's fire. As Red sleeps and dreams, as he's in his, subconscious mind, dreaming, Mandy rises from the mercurial water, her right eye darkened, a symbol of the Antichrist, described in Zechariah chapter 11, where the prophet explains represents not just the Antichrist of the end of days, the end of this wicked age, but corrupt leaders in general, those who've rebelled and, consciously chose to be Antichrists, and they see this as their, ultimate liberation. This connects Mandy to another symbolic feature of Luciferian esotericism, in which the woman is considered just as much a liberator as her Promethean guide Lucifer, the serpent in the garden who tempted Eve. She made the conscious choice to partake of the fruit and become her own god, and who, after taking the first bite, prompts Adam to do the same. In Luciferianism, a gross distortion of biblical theology that portrays God as a tyrant who desired to keep Adam and Eve, and ultimately all of mankind, in ignorance and in obedience like slaves, and the serpent portrayed as this Prometheus, bringing them the light of knowledge and freedom and liberation. It's a false light, of course, because God did not desire to keep Adam and Eve in ignorance and in obedience like some farm animals, but instead to temper knowledge with wisdom, a process that takes more than a single day in the garden. By taking the fruit, this makes Eve the first human rebel who chose to quote-unquote liberate herself from God, a catastrophic and foolish mistake. In doing so, in essence, she is the first Antichrist, a concept portrayed in a similar psychological horror, Lars von Trier's film, Antichrist. In that film, von Trier creates a very dark and disturbing Gnostic tale, another sinister inversion of the Genesis story that portrays the woman as the embodiment of evil, of rebellion and liberation from her tyrannical male counterpart, her husband, as well as the patriarchal world at large. She is the cause of the destruction of her traditional nuclear family, as she felt bound, imprisoned, and tortured within it, unable to free her true spirit and become who she was always meant to be. And who was she always meant to be? A witch, of course, part of a sisterhood that spans generations going back to the first Antichrist, Eve, who embraced the serpent and the craft and darkness, proving her to be the much stronger and more powerful of the species. Her husband, who represents all men, saw her as the weaker one, when in reality she is a formidable foe, superior in cunning, and much more depraved and sadistic than man could have ever imagined. Von Trier weaves in the three beggars, familiar spirits symbolized by the deer, representing grief, and the fox, representing pain where chaos reigns, and the crow, representing despair. In essence, the nihilistic worldview of the practicing Luciferian anarchist. In one scene, the husband finds a wounded fox, the spirit of pain, devouring itself, and proclaims, "Chaos reigns."
Chaos reigns.
While Red dreams of Mandy emerging from the alchemical mercurial waters expressing her darkened right eye, Mandy is simultaneously sleeping and dreaming and sees herself walking in the Eden-like gardens of her home, comes to a wounded and dead baby deer, a symbol of her own grief in nature's cruel genocide of the innocents. A single tear travels down her scarred cheek. The symbols used in these two films are identical and serve the same purpose.
Chaos reigns.
Mandy becomes the satanic inversion of Our Lady of Sorrows. Her sorrow? Children are still being born in the corrupted prison world of the demiurge, prisoners to the illusion of this patriarchal system, innocent and creative spirits left to die in the delusions of their own fathers. Mandy is seen reading a novel, Seeker of the Serpent's Eye, by the fictitious author Lenore Torr. The serpent's eye is a symbol of spiritual awakening. It's a symbol of the ancient wisdom of the mystery schools, the ancient cosmic wisdom. And through the possession of this object, one would gain the profound insight and the ability to see beyond surface-level reality that the object provides.
The wretched warlock reached into the dark embrace of the Phasia. His fist closed around the serpent's eye. Slowly he withdrew it and held it before him in the fading light of the blood-red suns.
And while Mandy is walking through the woods, the light turns to this eerie red. The only word visible on her shirt is Sabbath, which we know is the metal band Black Sabbath, but might also lend to Sabbath as in Saturday, or more specifically, Saturn Day. Saturn as in the Reaper. Red is always with her, always protecting her even when he isn't standing right next to her. And the wretched warlock is approaching now in the van. Jeremiah sees Mandy walking and is captivated by her appearance, and that darkened right eye, which she seems able to activate at will. Jeremiah, the wretched warlock, who for now holds the eye of the serpent, the orb is for now placed, totally in the wrong hands, and Mandy, with her darkened right eye, displays her affiliation with the serpent himself. The Jeremiah character is like, the reject of a much larger cult, which strongly alludes to the very real cult, the Process Church of the Final Judgment. And Jeremiah, along with his creepy carnival of inbred followers, call themselves the Children of the New Dawn. Jeremiah Sands represents the male ego run riot that feels perfectly entitled to take whatever he wants for himself. He desires to be served and adored like a god. He is a failed spiritual leader, and since, these movies are always an attack on the patriarchy and the traditional family, and just as the father is considered the spiritual head or leader of his family from a biblically moral standpoint, Jeremiah represents the same, giving the distorted message that man has no business taking on a leadership role of this magnitude. He'll screw it up because his ego is inherently toxic. This is the propaganda. And Jeremiah arranges for Mandy to be captured, to be kidnapped and brought to him, which requires the use of another mystical object, the horn of Abraxas, to call upon the Black Skulls. It's interesting that in real life, Linus Roach is in a leadership role in a very real New Age cult called Enlighten Next, known for its humiliation rituals, and who believe that through their special brand of meditation, man can evolve and then reach enlightenment, and then change the whole world. Roach's father was also an occultist, and as Linus put it, quote, has always been and still is a great influence, end quote. His father briefly became a druid in the 60s and celebrated summer solstice at Stonehenge. Jeremiah, the entitled narcissist, attempts to force Mandy to engage in a seduction ritual, but Mandy is not a candidate, and Jeremiah is certainly not a worthy adversary.
Do you like the Carpenters? I think that they're sensational, but this is even better.
If you're from my generation and a metalhead like I was, if you were asked if you liked the Carpenters, that was considered like the most square, commercial, mellow music that your parents would listen to. It was like the most uncool music ever. And this reveals more about how Jeremiah is completely out of touch about what it means to be hip, to be cool, to ascend. Again, he represents the boomer, the dad who listens to, dorky music. It's interesting that Linus Roach recorded not just the song that's in the movie, but they went further to record an entire album in his Jeremiah Sands persona titled Lift It Down, in which Charles Manson collaborated. Of course, Charles Manson was thought to be a former member of the Process Church. So let's get into number 44. You can see here Mandy is wearing Red's favorite number 44 shirt. As far as I know, the director has not revealed his use for the number symbolism here, so this is just my opinion. But my analysis is that it lends strongly to Crowley's gematria and use of the number 44 in his writings. As I've already mentioned, the number 44, or 4 times 11, in Aleister Crowley's gematria, represents the corruption of the created world, delineated in a collection of his writings titled The Kabbalah of Aleister Crowley. In Crowley's view, it is an quote-unquote attack on the 4, and the 4 means the Tetragrammaton. And the Tetragrammaton, of course, is the name of Yahweh, God of the Bible, by the 11. So let me break this down. The 11 is the great magical number that represents the magical force. 10 representing God, and 1 representing going one further. In other words, usurping God, going above God, going beyond God. Or in Crowleyan terms, it's the collective of maguses, the collective of magicians that are doing this great work of surpassing God, of dethroning God. Crowley's cosmology is rooted in Freemasonry and Gnosticism, part of the older orders, but a catalyst for bringing in the newer, more libertine, hedonistic, anarchistic brand of Freemasonry. Remember, the G inside the square and compass stands for Gnosticism, or Gnosis, the secret occult knowledge. The Tetragrammaton, standing for Yahweh, is in reference to the Demiurge, or the god of the Bible inverted, where he is described to be the corrupted evil creator god who made the material world, a prison for its inhabitants that keep them ignorant of the gnosis of their true nature. So when Crowley talks about an attack on the four, to him that's a very good thing. It's all the Maguses working as a collective force to destroy Yahweh, or at the very least obliterate him in the hearts and minds of humanity. Founding Golden Dawn member Samuel Liddell McGregor Mathers tried to interpret the Tetragrammaton as the synthesis of the four elements, earth, air, fire, and water, which reduced Yahweh to a pantheistic god of the natural world, which set Crowley into a mouth-foaming fury over this notion, calling it blasphemy. Crowley insisted on keeping the Tetragrammaton as Yahweh, the god of the Bible. That was vitally important to Crowley. Crowley wanted God usurped, he wanted him conquered, he wanted him dethroned. Crowley called himself the Beast, 666. This isn't a Gnostic term. Crowley wasn't a Gnostic himself. He conjured demons, for which he believed he could control them to do his bidding. This is the level of psychopathic arrogance this man maintained. He exploited Gnostic philosophy to subvert those who would be willing to turn away from the Abrahamic religions and embrace its heretical alternative, this Freemasonic Gnostic worldview and cosmology. Crowley called this the New Atheism. Keep in mind, the early Gnostics were anarchists. They were probably the first anarchists. They were the first arch-rebels of Christian society, coming in, between the 1st and the 4th century. They were reprobates, specifically mentioned by the apostles Paul, Peter, John, and Jude in the New Testament, whom Jude describes them as going, quote-unquote, the way of Cain, as a murderer of the brethren, mentioned in Jude chapter 1, verse 11. They were deliberately antisocial, anarchistic, heretical reprobates who caused hostility against the church from Roman authorities, resulting in more persecution and killing of genuine Christians along with these infiltrating subversives. This is who the secret societies and men like Crowley model themselves after. These are their heroes. The term Christian Gnosticism, or referring to it as a Christian religion in any way, has always bothered me, because the Gnostic heretics were probably about as antichrist as one can get, and probably, the proto-beast system of Revelation. Like, this is where the beast system really got launched. And when Jesus said, "Many will come in my name," perhaps he was also talking about these Gnostic heretics. In Crowley's book, The Equinox, he describes the number 44 as a number that represents blood, or 4 times 11 equals the corruption of the created world, and the 4 represents Yahweh, and the 11 represents the Maguses who are working to destroy him. The number 44 further means, quote, "without the shedding of blood there is no remission," end quote. So is it a comment about the state of the material world as being corrupt, or is it a goal, an agenda? My analysis is that while it is both, the material world is considered corrupt for someone with a classical Gnostic Antichrist worldview. It also lends strongly to the latter, where these workers of Crowley's magic are to actively participate in the destruction of the created world, as it currently stands, the destruction of the current world order, as it were. Crowley explains the magician's work in Part 2, The Universe as We Seek to Make It. Quote, "The numbers useful to him, therefore, will be those which are subversive of this state of sorrow. He finds no satisfaction in contemplating the tree of life and the orderly arrangement of numbers. He can leave nothing undisturbed. He is the anarchist of philosophy. It is part of the painful duty of the master of the temple to understand everything. He is of the supernals. He sees things from above, yet having coming from below, he can sympathize with all. But it must never be forgotten that everyone must begin at the beginning, and in the beginning, the aspirant is a rebel, even though he feel himself to be that most dangerous type of rebel, a king dethroned. Hence, he will worship any number which seems to him to promise to overturn the tree of life. He will even deny and blaspheme the One, capital O1, whom, after all, it is his ambition to be. He is tempted to curse God and die. This atheist, not in being, but in passing, is a very apt subject for initiation. He is tired of theories and systems of theology, and all such toys, and being weary and anhungered and athirst, seeks a seat at the table of the adepts, and a portion of the bread of spiritual experience, and a draught of the wine of ecstasy. There is a legend of Eve and the serpent, for Cain was the child of Eve and the serpent, and not of Eve and Adam, and therefore, when he had slain his brother, who was the first first murderer, having sacrificed living things to his demon, meaning Yahweh as the demiurge, had Cain the mark upon his brow, which is the mark of the beast spoken of in the Apocalypse, and is the sign of initiation. The shedding of blood is necessary, for God did not hear the children of Eve until blood was shed." End quote. So if you were ever wondering where the false teaching of the serpent seed and this looking upon Cain as an hero, an anti-hero, if you're wondering where that comes from, it's Freemasonry. So anyone who's teaching that, they're teaching Freemasonic stuff. Quote, "And thou shalt give the sign of the mother, for Babylon is thy fortress against the iniquity of the abyss, of the iniquity of that which bindeth her unto the crown, and beareth her from the crown. For not until thou art made one with chaos canst thou begin that last, that most terrible projection, the threefold regimen, which alone constitutes the great work." End quote. The number 44 is about exacting chaos, and the number 44 is related to the element of fixed air, masculine, or as the cherub of the air, or as we know as the prince of the air, sometimes symbolized by the eagle, which is visible in Mandy's drawing at the start of the film. The number 44 also represents the age of Aquarius, which Crowley referred to as the age of Horus, and its color is violet, a combination of red and blue. Kenneth Anger, friend and devotee of Crowley, talked about the ritual use of color in film to bring about emotional and physiological changes, which he believed could both temporarily and permanently create alterations to the brain and the body. In an article titled "Magic in Theory and Practice, Ritual Use of Color in Kenneth Anger's Film Invocation of My Demon Brother," Anger, known for films like Brush of Baphomet and Lucifer Rising, discusses his use of color in films as part of a ritual practice. Quote, "Each of Anger's films is framed as a ritual. They depict rituals, and if one accepts Anger's stated intentions, they also perform rituals. The various elements within each film are calculated to have specific effects upon the viewer. All his films have been evocations or invocations, attempting to conjure primal forces, which, once visually released, are designed to have the effect of casting a spell on the audience. Crowley's theory postulates a higher part of oneself that one must access in order to understand one's true will. This higher self is sometimes referred to as the demon brother, so that the title of the film, Invocation of My Demon Brother, can be read as a reference to a ritualized process of self-development. For Anger, the figure of the demon brother is closely linked to another figure that plays a central role in his oeuvre. This is Lucifer, who, whilst occupying a very minor position in Crowley's pantheon, is an important presence in each of Anger's films. In each film, a ritual is performed to invoke the powers that the director associates with Lucifer, an archetype with whom Anger as a magician wishes to identify. For Anger, Lucifer is both the patron saint of movies, in his capacity as god of light, and the rebel angel behind what's happening in the world today, whose message is that the key of joy is disobedience. Anger has named the cinematograph as his magical weapon. Warm, the red end of the spectrum, and cold, the blue end of the spectrum, colors have been found to differentially alter both physiological and emotional states. Color is also believed to produce a direct effect on the endocrine system via the pituitary gland. Its action is to increase aggressive behavior under long wave or red light and reduce it under short wave, blue-violet light. Any transformation that is affected in the viewer, psychological or otherwise, is a testimony to the power of the artist or magician with whom the images originate. Thus, Anger may well term his movies spells." End quote. Also in Mandy's drawing, Mandy is perhaps personified here blindfolded, suggesting the Greek goddess Lady Justice, a later interpretation of the Egyptian goddess Isis, sometimes seen holding a sword, or in Crowley's Tarot, she is the daughter of the flaming sword, lending back to the Genesis story. She is standing next to the lion, whom Crowley considered the beast, and the scarlet woman, Babylon, who rides it. Again from the Equinox. Quote, 666, chosen by myself as my symbol, partly for the reasons given in the Apocalypse. I took the beast to be the lion, Leo my rising sign, and Sol, Sol is the sun god of a secret ancient Roman fraternity that was much like Freemasonry, kind of like the early version of Freemasonry. Sol is the invisible, unconquerable sun, symbolizing the mystery schools. Quote, 666, the Lord of Leo on which Babylon should ride. End quote. So he's got the beast of Revelation, symbolized by the lion, whose lord is Sol, the ancient Roman sun god of early Freemasonry, of the mystery schools, who rules over Babylon, symbolized by the scarlet woman, who rides the beast. It's quite an image, right? Quote, note, however, that the tarot card of Leo, Strength, bears the number 11, the great number of the magnum opus, and its interchange with Justice, the number 8, the great number of redemption. And the key of 8 is 418, abrahadabra, the great magic word, the word of the aeon. Thus it interlocks pentagram and hexagram, end quote. Abrahadabra, formerly abracadabra, until Crowley changed it because he wants to be the one to take command of these interpretations, is the name of Abraxas, bringing me back to the horn of Abraxas, which temporarily in this film is in the hands of the wretched warlock, Jeremiah Sands. We never find out who gets the horn of Abraxas after Jeremiah meets his demise at the hands of the Reaper. Abraxas is a newer manifestation of a Gnostic god created by Basilides, a 2nd century Gnostic heretic. Basilides taught a dualistic cosmology, which, as I've already described earlier, dualism is the union of opposites, the divine union of opposites. Once represented by Abraxas, this was later symbolized by the Baphomet, the androgyne deity that represents the union of opposites as divine perfection. Abraxas is described as being a warrior god with a rooster's head and 2 serpents for legs. He carries a shield and a whip representing wisdom and power. Abraxas is an emanation of the monad, or the One, the highest Gnostic god. The monad is comprised of pure mind consciousness that exists outside of space and time, and from this mind emanates various entities, one of them being Abraxas. Early church father Tertullian described Abraxas as the heresy of Basilides, the 2nd century Gnostic. Basilides invented this supreme deity that he claimed emanated from the monad, and further, that out of Abraxas came principalities, powers, and infinite processions of angels, including the demiurge, we know as the God of the Bible, Yahweh. Basilides, the heretical reprobate, outright denied that Yahweh is God, but rather just an angel or an archon, and a low one at that. Basilides asserted that Christ was not the Son of God, but rather sprang forth from Abraxas like a phantasm, sort of like depicted here, and that he was not crucified, but rather that Simon Magus was crucified in his stead.
You know what Jesus' big mistake was? Huh? He didn't offer up a sacrifice instead. The cruciform is a constant reminder of that.
Remember the movie The Craft that came out in like the mid-1990s? Explains Manon, the entity that they worship in the movie. It was explained in press releases that Manon isn't the real name of the deity that's scripted in the film, but rather that they gave it this fictitious name so foolish adolescent girls enamored with the witchcraft portrayed in the film wouldn't be out here, calling on the name of a real entity and therefore unleashing a major archon without realizing that, they have to bind it first and then banish it later. Teachings taught by demon conjurer Crowley himself. The real deity, in my analysis, is Abraxas, where if God and devil were playing football, Abraxas is the field on which they would play.
You guys, maybe he'll really listen now. Who? Manon.
What's that? That's like God? No, man invented God. This is older than that. It's like God and the devil. It's the trees, it's the ground, it's the rocks, it's the moon, it's everything.
It's nature.
If God and the devil were playing football, Manon would be the stadium that they played on. It would be the sun that shone down on them.
Abraxas is considered to be beyond good and evil, a transcendent god above the playing field, that is, the material world, who embodies both good and evil as interworking divine aspects of his supremacy. In this regard, the forces of good and evil are equally important in Abraxas' role as a governing deity. Carl Jung, psychoanalyst, esotericist, and initiated into the Masonic Lodge in Zurich, Switzerland in 1913, where he remained a Freemason until his death, wrote about Abraxas in the Red Book, Liber Novus, in his 7 Sermons to the Dead. Jung considered Abraxas his god. While Jung is considered one of the most influential thinkers of the 20th century, his mapping of the human psyche was rooted solely in the occult. When you hear things like every person has their dark shadow self, or concepts like the collective unconscious, or the archetypes and personality types that can be mapped through tools like the Enneagram, these are Jung's contributions. And as seductive and relatable as they all might seem, it's occult mysticism, not science. The Red Book is Jung's experimental deep dive into his own subconscious, where across several sessions he sat and just let his imagination run wild, deliberately invoking fantasies in his mind and playing an active role within them, and then noting it all down. Keep in mind, Jung's thoughts were already influenced by Plato, esotericism, the occult, Freemasonry, and fellow Masons like Freud, Nietzsche, Kant, Schopenhauer, Eckhart, and so on. In the Seven Sermons to the Dead, he speaks of Abraxas that begins inside the pleroma. The pleroma is the heaven-like realm of the monad, the Gnostic heaven. What are the qualities of the pleroma according to Jung? It's these opposing forces, the effective and the ineffective, fullness and emptiness, living and dead, difference and sameness, lightness and darkness, force and matter, time and space, good and evil. In other words, the pleroma is the totality of all opposites, and Abraxas is the god of the pleroma. The pleroma and Abraxas are one. Jung writes, quote, Abraxas is the forgotten god. Nothing can resist him but the unreal. Abraxas stands above God and the devil. If the pleroma was capable of having a being, Abraxas would be its manifestation. Insofar as God and devil are creatura, they do not extinguish each other, but stand one against the other as effective opposites. Effectiveness joins them. Effectiveness, therefore, stands above both, is a God above God, since in its effect it unites fullness and emptiness. This is a God whom ye knew not, for mankind forgot it. We name it by its name, Abraxas. End quote. In the final sermon, Jung goes on to explain that Abraxas is man, or more specifically, like the Übermensch. Quote, as we are the pleroma itself, we also have all these qualities in us. This is the one God of this one man. This is his world, his pleroma, his divinity. In this world is man Abraxas, the creator and the destroyer of his own world. End quote. So basically, Abraxas is this sort of Hegelian idea of God, which allows these opposing forces of good and evil to synthesize, creating one single absolute, and this absolute is life itself. Hegel was also a Freemason and occultist who subscribed to Hermeticism and Theosophy. He was a hardened new atheist, and incidentally, a major influence on this guy, who had equal the arrogance, equal the mouth-foaming wrath and insolence toward Yahweh, the God of the Bible, as Crowley did, and fashioned an entire worldview and political system intended to destroy everything Yahweh created. And there's an excellent podcast with a scholar discussing this further if you're interested, and you can find it here. You should listen to this. It's very informative. Similarly, with Nietzsche, this idea of the totality of being where negative and destructive elements are not rejected or resisted, but rather seen as a necessary component of the good and true and desirable nature of man. And if you haven't noticed it yet, this is the underpinning of the philosophy of moral relativism, or more specifically, moral nihilism, the worldview and really the religion of the globalist elite today. There's no such thing as good or evil. They're all moral terms. They're social constructs. Nietzsche wrote a book titled Beyond Good and Evil, Prelude to a Philosophy of the Future. In it, he criticizes the great philosophers for building their premises on morality and the idea of good and evil as opposites. Nietzsche moves into the realm of beyond good and evil, discarding traditional morality in favor of this synthesis of opposites that is manifested in Abraxas. Freemason and esotericist Hermann Hesse, heavily influenced by both Carl Jung and Friedrich Nietzsche, wrote of Abraxas in his postmodern book Demian. In it he writes, quote, our God's name is Abraxas, and he is God and Satan, and he contains both the luminous and the dark world. End quote. Hess additionally reinterpreted the mark of Cain as a mark of exceptionalism, of nonconformism. The mark of Cain makes one special because it showed Cain wasn't afraid to rebel against God and embrace the forbidden, the dangerous, the immoral. Keep in mind, these are gross distortions of the Cain story. For Hess, Abraxas isn't just the god of good and evil combined. He's, quote, a deity whose symbolic task is to unite the divine and the satanic, end quote. Realize that with these new atheists, it's all about the deus ex machina, the God in the machine. It's all about the stories people tell that manifest God archetypes. And if you can imagine it, if you can think it, and then write it down, it becomes a consciousness-expanding utility. It becomes a God for a new atheist. Master Masons have written about obtaining the faculty of Abrac, and the faculty of Abrac is the wisdom that Abraxas offers that is useful for a practicing Mason. Crowley considered abracadabra as possessing great power, and in 1913 crafted his Gnostic Mass, where Abraxas is invoked as part of the ritual, and the god of the Process Church of the Final Judgment was Abraxas. The tiger is part of the cat family, so in esoteric tradition, the lion and the tiger are interchangeable symbols that represent a singular concept. To Jung, the tiger is the quote-unquote heavenly bride. The tiger is associated with Lucifer and the color red, described by renowned South American esotericist and occult teacher Samael Aoun Weor. Quote, the tiger is synonymous with Lucifer, with Prometheus, the avatar or reflection of the Logos or the Gnostic monad or all or the one. Indeed, axolotl Lucifer, the jaguar, the tiger, represents the particular individual Lucifer. Everyone within the very depth of his consciousness has his own Lucifer. End quote. And of course, the esoteric use of the lion and the tiger are grossly inverted. While in biblical terms, the adversary we know as the devil is described metaphorically as prowling around like a roaring lion looking for someone to devour. The lion represents the ultimate power, ultimate authority, and victory of Jesus, and the tiger similarly representing divine authority and ultimate triumph over chaos and evil. Beyond the Black Rainbow, which is the first film coming from Cosmatos, released in 2010, tells a similar tale in that he shows the failure of the boomer esoteric philosophies and how they play out in this triangle of characters between Dr. Nile, his failed mentor and founder of the Arborea Institute, Dr. Mercurio Arborea, and Elena, the object of Dr. Nile's obsession. The plot is paper thin and could probably fit scribbled out on a cocktail napkin, but it's very effective in its minimalist take. The idea is that Dr. Arborea had synthesized esoteric ideas of enlightenment with modern technology to try to achieve a state of nirvana, this conscious state of blissfulness, of like nirvana through better chemistry. Completely taken by his cult-like theories, Dr. Nile became his student and then later would run his entire operation, run the institute. During an initiation ritual, depicted here in overexposed, blinding white light, Nile is given a powerful psychedelic, almost like a sacrament, and submerged into a vat of the notorious black goo, an event that takes him to a hellish realm. The abyssal layer, if you will, and then to ego death, resulting in Dr. Nile having a complete psychotic break and being transmutated into a demon-like abomination, which he keeps painfully suppressed while he maintains operations in the institution. The focus of his obsession is Elena, the daughter of Dr. Arborea, who was also initiated as an infant and was also transformed, now having the ability of telepathy and telekinesis. She is not quite his opposite, as she can use her powers to destroy. But there is a juxtaposition happening here, where Nile holds her captive with a very sinister agenda in mind, while Elena works to escape the prison that he made for her. You can see the Kenneth Anger, Aleister Crowleyan use of color in this film, in combination with the notions of vibrational sound, and music to create cognitive and emotional changes, not just in Elena, but the audience as well. Dr. Nile is consistently represented in red, increasing the pulse rate, representing aggression, Elena in cool blue tones, giving a calming effect. The three primary colors, red, blue, and green, feature throughout, a color palette that is identical to Anger's film Invocation of My Demon Brother. The combination of all three colors, red, blue, and green, is thought to produce bright white, utilized in the initiation scene, with overexposed brilliant white offering perhaps the intensity that perfectly encapsulates this event from Dr. Nile's perspective. And then he's sent into the pit, the abyss, and as he put it later on in the film, he saw God, the black rainbow, and he chose him. He is going to set him free. As Elena is subjected to the same ritual directly on the heels of Dr. Niles, you can see him with his head fully bandaged, exposing only one eye. I've seen this type of bandage before, a few times actually, but most notably in a very early film created by Lars von Trier, again the writer and director of the film Antichrist I spoke of earlier. Lars von Trier was initiated into the Knight of the Order of the Dannebrog on January 14, 1997. He was also awarded UNICEF's Cinema for Peace Award at the 2004 Berlin International Film Festival, in spite of the fact that von Trier creates some of the most dark and disturbing satanic content to reach mainstream audiences. What I found interesting about von Trier's childhood years is that his parents were communists. Both of them, he reports, were atheists living extremely liberal lifestyles. Both were committed nudists who took Lars on several childhood holidays to nudist camps. Lars describes his childhood as very troubling, resulting in his bouts with extreme depression, inspiring both films, Antichrist and Melancholia. This is a clip from one of the first homemade horror films that a young 14-year-old Lars made that reveals some rather disturbing content for a boy of his age. Note the bandages on the head with only one eye exposed. Looks a bit ritualistic, don't you think? But in Beyond the Black Rainbow, the ideas of transhumanism are explored here, in which one can evolve with the assistance of external elements like chemicals, sound, music, philosophy, etc., and then transform into something more, something new, something beyond human. Transhumanism is also evident in the character of the sentionaut, the combination of human biology and machine, that while the sentionaut serves a purpose for the maintenance of the patients in the institution, it seems to also have some semblance of a conscience, its mechanical innocence symbolized with its childlike face. Cosmatos alludes almost to the idea of the sentionaut being an angelic being that can be created in a lab. They're like 8 or 9 feet tall, they're mechanical, and yet manifest some limited thoughts of their own. In the struggle between Dr. Nile and Elena, his depraved agenda is exposed, in which he had planned to incorporate these transhumanist, esoteric ideas to assist in levels of sadism that are beyond disturbing. Nile believes it will finally free him completely. It will further his evolution into his final form, whatever extremely dark and sinister and depraved form that might be. Again, Dr. Nile is the male ego run riot, and Elena proves to be the more powerful, formidable force. Her special abilities are so far beyond anything Dr. Nile could ever dream of becoming. And in typical fashion of the narcissist, he is envious. Envy wants to steal, kill, and destroy. Unfortunately for Elena, according to Cosmatos, she moves from one system of control right into another, the dismal world of conservative values that Reagan had campaigned, symbolized by the sterility of suburbia, the only light of knowledge being the flickering of a television set, entertaining the notion that our material existence is indeed a prison that keeps the masses in ignorance of their true nature, and nobody as of yet has found the way of escape, the true path to enlightenment. The idea of the black rainbow and of sexual sadism as a transhumanist path to liberation and enlightenment reminded me of the Hellraiser movies that became wildly popular in the same era of the mid-80s. Some find Cosmatos' concept of the Black Skulls to be reminiscent of the Cenobites, but I'm not sure that fits exactly. If anything, Dr. Nile is more of a candidate for a Cenobite. Dr. Nile is the type who would try to solve the lament configuration, to open the puzzle box, to seek the demented pleasures that it promises to provide. In the Hellraiser movies, the Cenobites were multi-dimensional immortals who reside in the hellish realm of the labyrinth being, of course, symbolic of the mind. But the mind of what or whom exactly? The Cenobites are summoned through the solving of the puzzle box by some curious, occult-oriented sadomasochists seeking the dark, hedonistic pleasures that this hellish realm can provide. The Cenobites come, after being summoned, and then snatch this person up and take them to the labyrinth to be judged by Leviathan, the Lord of the Labyrinth, this mechanistic god over all the dark arts who, like a machine, maintains strict order and who despises chaos. In Leviathan's view, mortal flesh is seen as corrupt and chaotic, which Leviathan abhors, and uses the Cenobites like a rank of militaristic high priests of this S&M hell or heaven, or however it's meant to be interpreted, to crush chaos and torture human flesh one condemned soul at a time. But condemned for what exactly? If the seeker is deemed worthy by Leviathan, which seems to be based upon their genuine devotion to seeking the gnosis that these liberating dark arts can provide, he or she is granted immortality to serve Leviathan as one of his militaristic high priests. If Leviathan deems you not worthy, it's largely due to being just a sleazy degenerate with no interest in, this consciousness raising and liberation and enlightenment this occult knowledge provides. It makes you unworthy, and then Leviathan rips them to shreds and they're tortured in the labyrinth for all eternity. What's interesting and relevant about Leviathan is the black light that emanates from it, the exuding of its cosmic darkness, if you will, the inversion of the true light of God. The darkness that exudes from Leviathan is able to scan the soul of man like an X-ray and know the depth of his darkness, the sin that dwells within him. And then Leviathan makes a determination, a judgment. The light of God and its inversion, they're both forms of light, both forms of knowledge, but occult darkness, the black rainbow, is the light that comes from the clopotic realm, the realm below the tree of life, the inverted hellish realm of the tree of death, teachings first developed by founding Golden Dawn member Samuel McGregor Mathers, and furthered by Crowley and his occult religion, Thelema. In esoteric terms, and in terms of demons like Abraxas, the dark realm is deliberately sought by the magician who desires to become, the master of the temple. It's considered vital to his great work and his path toward enlightenment, to his own divinity. And this might be a reach, but to me, the black rainbow sort of suggests an inversion to the Noah story in Genesis chapter 9, where the fallen angels, the Watchers, and their offspring, the Nephilim, and any human being polluted by their DNA, as well as the dark technologies and the occult sciences that they taught them, which was believed to have been taught to the children of Cain. Cain's descendants received the illicit technologies, the dark arts from the Watchers. They were judged and condemned and destroyed in the flood by God, and mankind gets a new start and a new covenant between God and man, signaled by the bow in the sky. Quote, "And God said, 'This is the sign of the covenant that I make between me and you and every living creature that is with you for all future generations. I have set my bow in the cloud, and it shall be a sign of the covenant between me and the earth.'" End quote. Going back to Mandy in the final scene after Red completes his Saturnalian wrath to rid his world of all corruption and to bring justice, he drives off into the distance and it's as if the world has completely changed to some alien tangent universe. three heavenly bodies loom large in the sky as he drives into the dawn of this brand new day. Isn't it interesting that there are three heavenly bodies on the horizon? Do you remember the tiger and buffalo ad for the metaverse? I talked about that most recently here. The tiger and buffalo ad also showed three heavenly bodies in the horizon, along with the Masonic owl and the hexagon. These celestial bodies, starting with Saturn, the primordial sun and ruler of the world, and Venus, the morning star, and Mars, the ruler of war. These three planets, this planetary alignment, is always connected to the Freemasonic, Platonian, Atlantean philosophy. These planets together symbolize the mythological primordial sky of the golden age of Atlantis, believed to be a highly advanced utopian civilization ruled by immortals, who through science and philosophy created a most perfect society. It was believed that during that pre-flood era, when the immortals, we know as the fallen angels, the Watchers, walked the earth, and Saturn, prior to having its rings, was believed to be our primordial sun that stood fixed in the northern sky. This Platonian vision of the perfect civilization of Atlantis is ruled by Sol, that I spoke about earlier, otherwise known as Saturn, otherwise known as Satan, the Lord of Mystery Babylon, the ruling elite's nameless, quote-unquote, ancient mystery religion they believe will usher in the new dawn of the new age. It is believed that our planet has been ruled for centuries by the high priests and sorcerers of this satanic Freemasonic solar cult. It is a quote-unquote brotherhood that strives toward the rise of their dark primordial sun, S-O-N, sun, whom they call the New World Teacher, often symbolized by the Osiris pose, the X, we know as the Antichrist, this counterfeit messianic figure who they believe will usher in their new global utopian vision of the new Atlantis.